Matt Kelly, are we becoming socialist in America? Or are we already socialist?
I suppose it depends on whom you ask and how you interpret that, because clearly, if you ask President Trump who the socialists are, he'll always say Democrats are ranting socialist lunatics, whatever, dude. But I am focusing on what's really happening in this world these days, where actually, I don't know. We have seen now the federal government take a very strong interests in at least two big US companies, Intel and US Steel, more probably to come. And I am trying to figure out, what does that mean for anti-corruption risk if we now have essentially state-owned entities or instrumentalities within the United States, which we really haven't had before. In another country, we'd all be saying that's sky high anti-corruption risk. Is that necessarily the same here if we're going to start that here in the United States? So let me first back up and let's go through exactly what the Trump administration has already done. Number one, back in June, it acquired a golden share in US Steel as part of its approval process to let US Steel be acquired by Nippon Steel from Japan. And the golden share gives President Trump, it expressly says President Trump, the power to veto or exercise control over several significant strategic decisions US Steel and Nippon Steel might make, such as the name of the company in the United States, cutting wages in the United States. Can't cut wages without approval of the president. So I guess we're into wage controls now. That sounds socialist to me. The president gets to appoint one director to Nippon's board and will have veto control over two more directors. And there are assorted other things the president can or cannot do, or will have authority over what Nippon can or can't do with the golden share. But I don't think that actually means we own equity in US Steel, as opposed to Intel, where now the United States does. So last week, as part of his strong arming of Intel, President Trump got Intel to agree to sell, I'll put air quotes around that for those who are only listening, 10% of Intel to the Trump administration in exchange for $9 billion of CHIP Act funding, which the Biden administration had already agreed to provide to Intel as a subsidy to help Intel be a still economically viable microchip manufacturer. And I'll be right up front, I believe we need that. We need to support Intel. But we went from giving it grants, which the Biden administration had promised, to Trump saying, no, if we're going to give you that money, you give us something in return. And now the Trump administration is the single largest shareholder in Intel. Just yesterday, the Commerce Department Secretary, Howard Lutnick, went on the air, I think on Fox. I can't imagine he goes on somewhere else, but either Fox or NBC, or one of the cable channels. But he started saying, we're going to do this more often, the Trump administration. And he expressly called out defense contractors and said that Lockheed Martin, for example, he claims that Lockheed gets about 97% of its revenue from the United States. I don't know if that's accurate, but since a Trump administration person said it, I will assume probably not. But nonetheless, Intel is now going to be a big, let me start over. Intel is going to be partially owned by the United States. Defense companies might be partially owned by the United States. US Steel, we have a golden share, which is not ownership, but it's control. I'm trying to figure out, so how does that work for anti-corruption? I get it that this would not necessarily be for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which applies to the United States bribing other government officials. And you can't bribe someone who's of an instrumentality, such as a hospital executive at a state-owned healthcare system in Europe or Africa or Asia. That would be an instrumentality, and those employees would be state-owned or foreign state government officials. You can't bribe them. How would that work with foreign laws looking at the United States? So if you are a supplier to Intel and you are a foreign business that supplies goods to Intel, and you bribe an Intel executive to take goods from your supplier business rather than some other supplier, have you violated some foreign country's anti-bribery act? And I don't know. And I can see that a lot of people would say, hold on, is Intel really going to be an instrumentality of the US government? Because it's not a majority shareholder. And in theory, the arrangement here says that Intel will not be controlled by the Trump administration. If you look at the tests, which is what it's the Ashkenazi decision or Esquenazi decision from 2014, to find what instrumentality would be, that's only under the FCPA, not under anti-bribery statutes of other countries. But if we use this as the benchmark, because it's the only one we have, I think, then you have to look through. There were 4 criteria. So is the business formally designated as government control? No, Intel hasn't been. US Steel hasn't been. But what's formally designated? Because Donald Trump went on TV and said, now I call the shots at US Steel. That sounds like he said, I am the controller. Does the government have a majority ownership stake in the entity? In US Steel, it doesn't have any. At Intel, we have 10%. That's not a majority. And we're supposed to be passive investors only who will vote according to what the board says. If you believe that Donald Trump is actually going to follow that promise, I have a bridge to sell you. Please see me after the podcast. The government's ability to select management. Didn't Donald Trump just threaten to fire Intel CEO a couple of weeks ago? And then he made nice with Intel CEO, who is now going to stay on. But now Donald Trump and the administration is the board's largest shareholder. Does he have an ability to decide who the senior managers are going to be? He has that ability to some extent at US Steel. I'm not sure that he has it in Intel by law, but he certainly has it in practice. So this is a long-winded way of me saying, if we use the Esquenazi ruling from 2014 as a definition for what an instrumentality is, I don't think that criteria fits a Trump 2.0 administration. And I'm not sure foreign governments, assuming they use that criteria at all, and maybe they'll come up with something else, they could look at all of that and just say, who are you kidding? Clearly, Donald Trump thinks he is in charge at Intel. Clearly, he thinks he's going to call the shots at US Steel. Probably only going to use negative control to say, no, you can't do this. You have to do some other thing. I don't know that he's going to sit there and make strategic plans and announce that Intel is going to start acquiring this company, the other, or they're going to unveil a new chip design. Maybe he would, probably not. But you can't ignore the enormous influence that the Trump administration now has over some very significant businesses that all of whom so far, they do business in other parts of the world. So if you're a business in that other part of the world working with these Intel or US Steel employees, or maybe others, what about if we try to take an ownership stake in Lockheed Martin? Why stop there? Why wouldn't we take an ownership stake in a big healthcare company? Because I thought fighting disease was a national interest. So are we going to take a stake in Johnson & Johnson or Merck or Pfizer? What if you're a foreign company and you're dealing with them? If you bribe those employees now, have you violated an anti-corruption statute somewhere else? I do not pretend to have the answers to any of these questions, but we are foolish if we don't sit down and realize we have crossed a threshold here that we need to think about as anti-corruption people, because Donald Trump is corrupt. And now he has influence over some very big US companies. How's this supposed to work? And this has been on my mind for a while here. So I'll stop there, but I don't know.
Karen, you have a question for Matt.
I do. I am really unsure what happens when you have got government representatives on the board and the compliance department or somewhere in the organization uncovers potential wrongdoing, and you report to the board and discuss some sort of a strategy. Do we disclose, not disclose? How does that government board representative ensure their duty of loyalty to the company rather than to the government?
That is exactly the thing. And if we have, let's take US Steel as an example now, because Donald Trump will be able to appoint at least one director to US Steel, and he'll have veto control over 2 more. So I would say, by definition, that person the president appoints, he can't be independent. The arrangement, if you read the golden share stipulations, they say that this person is independent. I would respectfully say, what planet are you on? And what do they smoke there? Because clearly the person is going to be beholden to President Trump. So I would say, by definition, you can't represent shareholder interest at all times. You answer to somebody else. If that person is that person going to be on the audit committee? If you had an incident that had to be reported to the audit committee, then they get word of it. If we're talking about misconduct that might actually be regulated by the Trump administration, that's an inherent conflict of interest. We've never had to consider this before because we have never been, I don't know, short-sighted, foolish, socialist, whatever adjective you want to say. We've never done this before, really, as a country. We did it briefly right after the financial crisis, where the Obama administration took ownership stakes in the automakers, but with the express and clear intent to get out of that and sell it as soon as possible, which they did. That is not at all what Donald Trump wants to do. He sees this as Intel is important to the country. We're putting money into Intel, so therefore I get to decide what Intel does, and I'm going to keep on doing it as long as I'm president. That is what Donald Trump thinks. That is not at all what we did in the Obama administration. So I would say, look to that ownership stake during the financial crisis. That's not a valid analog. We don't have any analog for what we're talking about here, and I don't have an answer for you.
Mr. Armstrong, what does the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland have to say on this matter?
I think it raises quite a lot of issues. I think, could an entity that has government shareholders become a public entity for bribery law? Yes. I think we looked at these issues without getting any definite answers around the time of a lot of governments taking shares in banks, for example, after the financial crisis. So I think that's certainly a live issue. Of course, under the Bribery Act, it doesn't matter so much whether it's public or private, because we prohibit both of those. But there are issues around the margins, and it will make a difference in some jurisdictions. I think that if I were the president of the US, and that's not likely to happen any day soon, this would require a lot of thought, wouldn't it? For example, there are there's an increasing rearmament in Europe. The likely winner is Lockheed Martin. They're bidding for a lot of F-35 contracts at the moment across Europe. As we speak, there's a big air show in Poland, which regrettably has had to be cancelled because of the tragic death of a pilot. But that was definitely, I will have no doubt, a topic of discussion in the surrounds of that event today. The fact that Lockheed Martin might go closer into US state ownership might mean that a lot of nations look for alternative sources of supply, because they're worried that if they support Ukraine, for example, and the US administration doesn't, they won't be able to get parts, they could be embargoed, etc., etc. So this isn't necessarily in the US's best interests. And even if you look at organizations like Intel, all companies want certainty. They don't want that volatility that non-conventional ownership might bring. There are also issues around politically exposed persons, for example. If you have a political appointee on your board and you're trying to do business with somebody, then they're likely to have to go through a whole rigmarole. If the individual's a political appointee on the board, that probably makes them a PEP. That probably means that you've got to go through extra hoops in terms of money laundering and other laws, etc., etc. So it creates a lot of nightmares for compliance professionals in terms of extra due diligence, extra checking, etc. You can see how some customers will just take a simple route where one's available. And perversely, that simple route might be China, where you just know everybody's a PEP and you don't have to do the due diligence. And then maybe the last thing I'd say is that we've already had this sort of muscling off between the US and the European Commission, particularly around regulation, particularly new digital legislation, is the EUI Act, and overreach, etc. We've had some saber rattling from Commissioner Pino. This just makes that whole environment more difficult. And Europe currently are like a dog with a bone over some of these issues. So the net loser could be the US economy. It's not as binary as you think in world affairs like this.
I agree with all of that. And, what a shocker that a president who went bankrupt 6 times and has failed at pretty much every business he's ever launched might have economic poor judgment. But nonetheless, I think your point about politically exposed persons is excellent. What are we supposed to do with this? Like the appointee to U.S. Steel's board by the president, clearly that seems to me that would have to be a politically exposed person. How are you supposed to treat that if you are a U.S. Steel customer or supplier or something like that? I would love to know what U.S. Steel people think about this too. Not that they'll ever tell me, but this is a terrible precedent that opens all sorts of unpleasant cans of worms. And I could easily envision that if we do wind up taking stakes in defense contractors such as Lockheed Martin or RTX or Boeing or somebody else like that, good Lord, the corruption opportunities would be so massive, or the corruption risk from Europeans who would want to buy defense equipment from US businesses that might now be construed as instrumentalities, because we have this loose definition from the Eskenazi ruling, but number one, Europe doesn't have that. It was only applying to the United States. And two, I just don't think that those criteria, they don't fit how Donald Trump sees the world. And so who are we kidding when we say that he's not a controller of Intel or US Steel or some other company that we might take an interest in? Of course, he's going to see that he's a controller. And what are all the implications for that? How are we supposed to respond to it? We have no idea, but we are going to find out the hard way, I fear.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet. Every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.